Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of session 25 of Pre-Socratics to Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. We are talking about Augustine, and we already saw that Augustine refutes skepticism, or at least he takes himself to refute skepticism. And once he has pointed out that at least we know these introspective things, such as I remember, I judge, I understand. Once we've pointed that out, he thinks we can kind of return to a more optimistic assessment of our ability to know the world. And he introduces a distinction between 3 kinds of knowledge. First, knowledge that we have through the senses. Second, knowledge that the mind has even though it does not come through the senses. And we can think of that maybe in the terms that we used earlier in the semester, knowledge of intelligibles. What I want to focus on is the third kind of knowledge of testimony. That is a notion that we haven't yet encountered earlier in the semester, and I want to invite you just to think a little bit about it. Augustine introduces it in a kind of rhetorical gesture. He says, well, if there was no knowledge of testimony, then people who haven't traveled to the sea would not be able to know that there is the sea. And doesn't that seem absurd? And that is supposed to be just an example of, there are so many things that we come to know because maybe we read about them in a book. Someone else tells us about them. Maybe we take a class, someone tells us about them. And presumably that is how we get to know a lot of things. But that is knowledge of so-called testimony because there is someone else who tells us something. And it comes to be our knowledge, presumably not because we ourselves sense-perceptually perceive it. And also not because simply by thinking we come up with it. Rather, it comes to be our knowledge, if it is knowledge, by someone else telling us about it. And the question that I want you to think about for your final homework assignment is, in the light of what we studied in Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, and the Stoics, do you think that any of these earlier Greek philosophers would have accepted the idea that there genuinely is such a thing as knowledge of testimony, not just beliefs that we acquire because someone else tells us about something, but genuinely knowledge? And I want you to think about this with respect to the distinction between sense-perceptual knowledge and theoretical knowledge, or knowledge of intelligibles. In the former case, it might seem that, if you wanted to push back against the idea of knowledge of testimony, you could say that is merely hearsay. Someone told me about it. I don't know it. I have heard about it. And maybe I believe it. Maybe I think that the person who told me about it is trustworthy in general. Maybe I think even that she's an expert. But I haven't really seen it myself. And you could argue, and you would be, say, on Plato's side, if you did that isn't really knowledge. Similar for intelligible matters. If someone tells you about something theoretical, then it could seem that as long as you haven't yourself really thought it through and appropriated it for your own thinking, you don't really understand it. But what is it to just be able to repeat, as it were, something intelligible? Really, you need to understand it. Otherwise, you don't know it. And again, if you were to say that, you would take the side of Plato. So the last assignment asks you to kind of take a stance on this. Do you think that there is knowledge of testimony, of sense-perceptual and intelligible things, or would you take the side of Plato and somehow find that problematic